Are things starting to cook? Well, I'll explain what I mean by this in today's video and give my perspective, even though nothing I say is financial advice, and even though I'm not telling anyone to do anything, I would arguably like to lean towards yes, because remember in my last video when I was talking about seeing all these billboards throughout Las Vegas showcasing like XRP, but now apparently I've seen another one, and this one actually happens to be in front of Treasure Island, which, you know, I just think it's a pretty cool thing. In the background, we see this large guitar-like building being built, which of course is going to be the Hard Rock. But I'm saying, besides that point though, when I take a look at that right there, what does this even have anything to do when it comes to Zebec? It's because, of course, like I mentioned in my previous video, Simon, the CEO of Zebec, is planning to attend XRP Las Vegas, and that event is going to be from April 30th to May 1st, and of course, it's going to be in Las Vegas. And during that event, he's going to be planning to make a major announcement. So seeing these billboards, I think, as of right now, I think it's just pretty cool. But even besides that point, did you know that quite recently, Zebec made a post, and this was just something that I felt like was a little bit mysterious, right? It felt a little bit kind of ambiguous, but I wanted to talk about this. So basically, they made a post saying compliance first, institution focused, they say 4 acquisitions in 4 years. Wow. When it comes to that, I think those are some very impressive statistics. Not to mention, Simon, the CEO of Zebec, he's talking about what's driving Zebec's next chapter. And he says, ahead of our debut at XRP Las Vegas this weekend. Whoa, I'm just quite curious because all hypothetical signs are kind of pointing to Simon maybe announcing a Ripple partnership. Maybe. We haven't seen that yet. We've seen the XRPL integration so far when it comes to Zebec, but we haven't seen the real McCoy. We haven't seen the real thing in terms of a Ripple partnership hypothetically yet. So that's what I'm looking for. But again, making a post like this, especially when it comes to Zebec, felt a little bit sort of mysterious, felt very kind of ambiguous like that, so close to that event or that conference on April 30th, all the way up until May 1st. This, I think, wow, again, if I take a look at that right there, the signs, I hypothetically kind of see it, maybe, right, in a hypothetical in which wouldn't necessarily surprise me if there was, let's say, an actual Ripple partnership. Now, what will that do when it comes to Zebec upon, I guess, its immediate announcement, if it were to even happen? Now, I think in terms of an immediate sense, we could hypothetically see more people talking about it. We could see more posts about it. Will it really impact the charts? Now, I think that when it comes to charts, it's very difficult to tell because if we take a look at, let's say, the Stellar partnership, when that was announced, it didn't do something so massive to the charts, but what it did do was that eventually the amount of holders started to increase and it became like eventually over 100,000, like what we see of as of right now, even though previously, before the Stellar partnership announcement, it was like at around 96,000 to my understanding. But now it's like around 102,000. But even besides that, if let's say like a Ripple partnership did hypothetically happen, if let's say something along the lines of what happened in regard to the Stellar partnership where the amount of holders kind of slightly increased, it wouldn't necessarily surprise me. That's the thing. When it comes to the charts, again, that's sometimes very dependent on the market sentiment and stuff like that. But at the same time, if something like what the Stellar partnership caused in terms of Zebec happened, but to maybe a bigger extent because, of course, Ripple is just more massive, if let's say that was the aftermath of that, like the result, basically, it wouldn't surprise me. Now, people like to say, well, why does having more holders, let's say, even matter when it comes to Zebec? They say that, okay, Zebec recently reached 100,000 holders, but ZBCN is way lower than where it was last year. Okay, I understand that. But we have to consider, as of right now, the market sentiment isn't the best. What happens if it does become better? If there's more holders, hypothetically, sometimes we see a little bit of a bigger community. Sometimes people would arguably say more stability, not to mention arguably more people talking about it, right? That's just the way to take a look at it. A lot of these projects out there are very community driven. So if the community could hypothetically, I guess, increase as a result of the Stellar partnership, which we did see, arguably, and maybe to a bigger extent, hypothetically, if we do see an actual Ripple partnership, why is that a bad thing? Even if it doesn't immediately affect the price charts, I don't think it's like a failure. right? I think especially in the long term, it could hypothetically matter a lot, especially if the market were to maybe pick up again. But that's the thing. Now, the market sentiment changing, that requires me waiting. It just requires time, basically. It's just like, waiting for paint to dry. What can I do about it? A Ripple partnership would really be such a needle mover, right? Especially when it comes to the sentiment in regard to Zebec in the long term. It may not have an immediate effect, but especially in the long term, I think it could matter because in terms of maybe wanting better partnerships moving forward in regard to institutional partnerships, maybe outside of this space, that could matter a lot. And also maybe to a certain extent, not even with necessarily large scale enterprises, maybe with just kind of medium sized businesses and stuff like that. I think that matters a lot. If they can say, you know what, we have a partnership with Stellar, with Ripple, and also with Algorand, that's kind of a trifecta right there. We have to consider Algorand has an aspect of ISO 20022. I even saw a statistic not too long ago when it comes to Algorand as to how it was the technology of choice for over 2,000 global organizations. Not to mention, we take a look at Algorand, Coinbase has talked about its security, Charles Hoskinson has talked about its security to a certain extent, and keep in mind Charles Hoskinson is the founder of Cardano and the co-founder of Ethereum, and not to mention in Google's quantum paper that I saw not too long ago, in regard to the most mentioned blockchain within that paper other than Bitcoin and Ethereum, that was Algorand. That's the thing. So we already see Zebec have a partnership with something of that caliber, right, of that size, basically in the case of Algorand. Now, we've already seen a Stellar partnership, but does Stellar really need an explanation anyways? One of the most massive projects out there within this space that's focused on global trade and finance. The Stellar blockchain is, of course, very massive. We saw Stellar not too long ago have an extension in regard to their 5-year partnership with MoneyGram. So we've already seen that. The Ripple partnership, that's just the massive cherry on top that we haven't seen yet. We've seen the milkshake, we've seen the whipped cream, but we haven't seen the cherry on top. That's the thing. And it's a very massive cherry on top at that, right? Because that would be just a game set match, Avengers Endgame type of moment. But we'll wait and see. That's the thing. I'm just going to wait. But you know what? Again, if Zebec moving forward, people like to say, oh, those partnerships aren't really going to do anything. I kind of disagree because if they want future partnerships moving forward, again, they can say, you know what we bring to the table is experience. We've seen the fundamentals there. We've already seen the partnerships, like for instance, Stellar, Algorand, and maybe hypothetically Ripple, who knows? That could be kind of a talking point right there, right? It's like for instance, the Jeep Wrangler. What is the unique selling point of that, in my opinion? That we can remove the top, right? We can remove the doors. It can go off-roading, right? It has a cool factor, has that, rugged vibe. That's a unique selling point. Now, for a Mercedes-Benz, the unique selling point could be, a smooth ride, right? Maybe a very well-tailored interior, like that. So when it comes to cars even, they have their own unique selling point. I think much like when it comes to projects within this space, they also need to have their own unique sort of advantage. So if Zebec could complete that trifecta, I would like to call it, in terms of that partnership, in terms of, again, Algorand, Stellar, and then maybe Ripple, we'll wait and see if it could complete that. That's, game over. In a good way, I think, not in a bad way, because I think it's like game, set, match. In terms of a different trifecta, though, we've already seen SOC2, MICA, and ISO 20022 when it comes to Zebec. But this is kind of like the second ultimate trifecta. Again, it's kind of like, if I were to put an analogy on it, the Rolls-Royce Phantom of partnerships for Zebec would probably be that Ripple partnership. But we'll wait and see. However, I'll be sure to make more updates moving forward. I want to say thank you for watching. It's been Lee the Captain. I'm out. Peace. Bye.